Tonight's lecture is on the Duane Norman Diedrich Collection. Some of you I know Duane. We think he is the senior-most member of the Clements Library Associates. We know his membership goes back at least to 1958. So he has a proud record as a supporter of the library. He is an extraordinary collector, as Cheney will detail. We know that Duane's collecting goes back at least to his high school years, when he started to collect in the areas that he found of interest. He has been a Clements supporter in so many ways that if you Google Clements Library supporter, I suspect Duane's picture will pop up. He's also the senior-most member of the Clements Library Associates Board of Governors. So personally and professionally, I'm delighted that we have an exhibit about his collection. I'm delighted we're able to honor him here tonight and through the exhibit. If those of you who have not yet done so but are inspired by hearing about Dr. Diedrich think that you should step up and do a donation, I urge you to do it by mid-December. If you haven't yet learned that the Victors for Michigan campaign is ending at the end of December, I assume you are from Ohio State or some other benighted place, because everybody in southeastern Michigan is aware of this. And every donation that the Clements gets by mid-December, we can count in that campaign. And that will be good for us, because we're near the top of the pyramid of units on this campus that have exceeded their campaign goal. And finishing higher, thank you, will let us shine as a small but bright star on this campus. So that lottery winning that you will pick up Friday night or Saturday in the hundreds of millions, you just come over to my office on Monday morning and I will help you with tax deductions for all the money you're going to have. Tonight's speaker is Cheney Schopieray. He has been involved with the Clements Library, we figure, for at least 16 years as a long-term student, something like 14 years as a UM student, I believe, in 4 majors. The last 9 years, he's been on the full-time staff as a member of the Manuscript Department. He has headed the Manuscript Division for us for the last 5.5 years. Most of you know Cheney. I will forego the usual praise of him. He's a fine young colleague. He's a fine young scholar. We are delighted to have him as a member of the Clements family. And I ask you to join me in welcoming to the podium.
Hi. Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon. And thank you very much for joining us on this rather pleasant day. This is a special day for me, as I have the opportunity to discuss an exhibition of selections from one of the William L. Clements Library's great treasures, the Duane Norman Diedrich Collection. Now, describing the Diedrich Collection is always a challenge, because it supports scholarship in many different subjects and spans over 300 years. It contains original, handwritten materials by a wealth of famous names and by little-known historical figures. It represents over 250 acquisitions by the Clements Library, totaling over 110 archival collections and bound volumes, and plus over 1,100 individual manuscripts. But while it's broad in scope and is heterogeneous in composition, it is not haphazardly assembled. It is a collection used with regularity in the reading room and in classrooms. And I may have just shut off my slide presentation. There we are. Materials from the Diedrich Collection have been utilized in documentary editions and in Pulitzer Prize-winning books. On the screen, you'll see several of them. And many of them will be familiar to you if you've attended some of our lecture series. The collection wouldn't exist if it weren't for a single donor. For those of you who know Dr. Diedrich, I don't need to tell you that he's a modest man with an intensely private character. I respectfully offer this brief sketch of his career. D.N. Diedrich graduated from the University of Michigan with his bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in 1956, 1957, and 1961, respectively. He taught in the University of Michigan Department of Speech before leaving to pursue a career in academic teaching and administration elsewhere in the Midwest. Professor Diedrich had an interest in American history instilled in him by his parents, E.L. and Blandina Diedrich, and as a child visited many historic sites with his family. His interest became tangible, shall we say, when General Douglas MacArthur sent him this letter that's pictured on the left in 1952. It reads, and I quote, "Thank you very much for writing as you did and for sending me a copy of your thesis, Foreign Policy in War and Peace. It is most encouraging to find a high school senior taking such an intelligent and energetic interest in the affairs of his country. With all good wishes for your success at the University of Michigan." End quote. Inspired by the letter, Dr. Diedrich chose to continue his studies at the University of Michigan and to begin collecting original manuscripts pertinent to early American history. His first purchase was a signature of Theodore Roosevelt on a heavy stock White House card. While working toward his doctorate in 1958, Diedrich joined the Clements Library Associates and later served on the organization's Board of Governors. The library is very fortunate to have sparked his interest and attention. In 1977, Dr. Diedrich arranged to build collaboratively with the Clements Library a collection of original, authentic, and historical holograph manuscripts in the categories of religion, education, government, literature, art, music, business, science, and philanthropy. More specifically, including all phases of American education, philanthropic foundations, patriotic songs of America, family life, the perpetuation, articulation, and extension of Christianity, the presidency of the United States, and speech manuscripts by historically important speakers. When founding the collection, Dr. Diedrich wisely emphasized that the foregoing should not be construed as an exhaustive list of his interests. The basic concept was that Professor Diedrich would provide gifts in kind, funding, and counsel, while the Clements Library would catalog and continue to add appropriate materials to bolster the collection. And now, after over 40 years of acquisitions, the Diedrich Collection has complemented existing holdings, it's added nuance to certain research areas, and it's helped to expand the manuscripts division's focuses, especially to intellectual, artistic, and social history, and also chronologically to the First and Second World Wars. And the Diedrich exhibit on display, I hope, illustrates this. Supporting existing strengths, for example, is this document signed by Nathaniel Morton on March 8, 1678, while Secretary of the Plymouth Colony. This manuscript concerns the relationship between Plymouth and the other New England colonies following King Philip's War. Another example might include this letter by John Heckewelder to Samuel Sitgreaves, in which this Moravian missionary sought reparations for losses sustained during the American Revolution and described missionary work among the Ojibwa and other tribes in Ohio. Now, Professor Diedrich dedicated portions of the collection to the memory of individuals who had significant impact on his life. The contents of each memorial collection reflects the life and interests of the recognized individual. The most voluminous of these are the collections of Dr. Diedrich's parents, E.L. Bud Diedrich and Blandina Diedrich. Their collections include, respectively, manuscripts pertinent to business, patriotic music and government, and Christianity, the home and family. Other individuals so memorialized are Harvey L. Sherwood, social science and history teacher at Kalamazoo Central High School, Professor G.E. Densmore of the University of Michigan Speech Department, and Zachary Joseph Daniel Novak, a gifted and accomplished musician and aspiring artistic director at Indiana University who passed away prematurely in 2006. The Blandina Diedrich Collection, for example, includes dozens of sermons and other manuscripts by known and unknown ministers. Here is a page from the notebook of a colonial parson who appears to have led at least one congregation in Connecticut. The volume begins with a reflection about Thanksgiving Day in 1713. Perhaps one of the most significant groups of manuscripts is part of the E.L. Diedrich Collection, 23 letters and writings of Fisher Ames, who served as Massachusetts representative to the first United States Congress. These manuscripts concern pressing issues of the legislature, views on the role and composition of the federal judiciary, the 1796 presidential election, the location of the U.S. Capitol, and other subjects. Now, the Diedrich Collection is not just a research collection, but it is also particularly well suited for teaching purposes. As a professor of speech, Dr. Diedrich incorporated his historical manuscripts into his pedagogy. Summarized from his own words, he brought authenticity and authority to his classroom instruction by showing students original speech drafts, podium notes, and varying printed versions of his speeches. These materials added relevance, introduced and emphasized concepts, provided illustrations of speech writing processes, and improved student engagement. The curators of the Clements Library work with faculty to provide lecture and workshop-style classes utilizing original manuscripts, and rarely does a semester pass without some portion of the Diedrich Collection being used as a teaching tool for a university course on subjects ranging from undergraduate historical analysis to graduate-level law. With students increasingly engaged with computer screens and digital reproductions, I'm personally very happy to report that the inspiration and the excitement that students gain from exposure to original primary sources continues to be palpable. These are not facsimiles, not copies, not published versions, not digital surrogates, but the actual items produced at the time. This letter by Susan B. Anthony to a Mrs. Crowley has been in 2 classrooms within the past year or so. In it, she sought a woman to travel around Western New York to secure signatures for a petition to the New York State Senate in which they demand the right of suffrage and full citizenship. Visual resources such as this amusing self-portrait of Thomas Nast are also present in the Diedrich Collection. You'll remember Nast as the artist who created the rotund and jolly Santa Claus and who first conceived of the elephant as a representation of the Republican Party. Nast supplemented his work with lecture tours, and here he is, sweating and standing at a podium and lecturing in front of a frowning crowd. Standalone autographs have teaching value as well. 2 semesters ago, I sat with a group of graduate students to discuss manuscript reproduction techniques. Dr. Diedrich amassed a modest grouping of these custom White House cards on which U.S. presidents or members of the presidential family could sign their names for autograph seekers. With limited time to provide such autographs, presidents and other officials utilized stamps and auto pens to record and reproduce their signatures. So, for example, in the upper left is a William McKinley that's produced with an auto pen. In the upper right is an original McKinley. On the lower left is a James Garfield stamped signature. And most exciting, perhaps, this is just a small detail from a letter. This is the United States Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall's signature. This is the original signature that was used to create the auto pen signature for Marshall during the Second World War. American education is a primary focus of the Diedrich Collection, with source materials on subjects such as the establishment and maintenance of schoolhouses, agreements and financial papers about compensation for teachers, and archives and letters of instructors and students. These papers reflect familial, religious and spiritual, primary, secondary, and higher education, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. On the left, you see a page from a New England schoolmaster's teaching book from the latter part of the 18th century. It contains instructional exercises in arithmetic, geometry, surveying, navigation, and writing. Notably, the teacher included lists of his pupils' names, information about their families, and a record of where he delivered his classes. And on the right is a student's copybook, in which Margaret Montgomery of Wenham, Massachusetts, practiced her penmanship by copying alphabetic characters and rhyming moral verses. Horace Mann is recognized as the father of public education in America. His work on the Massachusetts Board of Education helped develop the minimum duration of a school year, research and recommendations on school buildings and supplies, support for instructors through improved wages, the development of normal colleges for teaching the teachers, and much else. Now, while the Massachusetts Historical Society has Horace Mann's papers as retained by Horace Mann and his family, Dr. Diedrich performed an extraordinary service to the historical record by seeking out and acquiring, sometimes one at a time, 162 letters and documents comprising Mann's outgoing correspondence. Now, this is a difficult feat, as you might imagine, since the letters passed down through as many families as Mann had recipients. These letters contain information on everyday nuts and bolts concerns and are of great use to scholars who wish to have an understanding of the practical development of public schools. Scattered throughout the Diedrich Collection are letters of educational and moral advice. These letters offer scholars a unique perspective on societal and family values, expectations of youth and young adults, educational responsibilities, and the character traits and habits deemed important by their elders. In the exhibition, you'll see an 1807 letter of advice from Secretary of War General Henry Dearborn to his son, and an 1891 letter from Charles Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, to his niece. Now, being spellbound by Alice's adventures in Wonderland as a child, I'd like to read a brief passage from his letter. He writes, "Your father has, I think, not quite understood the object of which I advised a sojourn of 2 or 3 years in Oxford. He seems to think it was that you might acquire a great mass of knowledge. But the object I really meant was an education, which is a very different thing. I should define it as a cultivation, to the utmost degree of perfection they are capable of whatever powers God has given you, so that, whatever work in life He may mark out for you to do, you may be ready to do it. Not only in improving your own powers, but also in acquiring all those habits needed for making the best of life. And I don't mean by the best of life the best for yourself, but the best for others. That is a truth that's becoming more and more clear to me as life passes away, that God's purpose in this wonderful, complex life of ours is mutual interaction all around. Every life, with perhaps some few exceptions, such as Robinson Crusoe, bears upon or ought to bear upon the lives of others. That is what you want your faculties for. Whether you are to be rich or poor, married or single, needing to earn money or not needing it, you may be certain that there will be some work for others meant for you to take up and only needing to be looked for." The Diedrich Collection includes individual items and archives related to military training at West Point, before and after the formal establishment of the United States Military Academy in 1802. These materials include letters and diaries of cadets and instructors, reports, and administrative papers. This is a manuscript copy of Major E.C. Boynton's Special Orders No. 9, outlining the order of proceedings for a June 1868 commencement, with an illustration showing the plan for the ceremonies. I've dedicated one case in the exhibit to sports and athletics, displaying highlights from Professor Diedrich's collection of educator and inventor of basketball, James Naismith. In one letter, Naismith wrote in response to a query by a gentleman wishing to recreate the first basketball game played. Naismith informally detailed the original rules of the game and provided a brief description of the equipment used. Quote, "I've frequently been asked to put on a game resembling the first one. I've asked that they find 18 young men, 23 to 30 years of age, with mustaches, and who had never seen or read or heard of a game of basketball, and then I could put on a good representation of the first game. Whenever I've tried to do this, the players have injected the new rules or have gone to the other extreme and have made it rougher than football." In the 1930s type speech draft with manuscript revisions that you see on the right there, he discussed the value of athletics for developing the character and morality of individual players. He believed that thinking of basketball as a school versus school event, rather than a contest between athletes, hindered the character-building aspects of athletics. He also remarked on the detrimental impact of commercialism on this aspect of sport and sportsmanship. And although I don't have an image of it in the slideshow, you'll see on display the first book on golf printed in America by James Lee in 1895. Original writings by certain literary figures draw up emotions and memories of childhood, church, school, and family. On display, you'll see manuscripts by Hoosier poet James Whitcomb Riley and poet and author Joyce Kilmer. Riley composed Little Orphan Annie and other dialect poems dealing with scenes of American life. And Kilmer is best known perhaps for his 1913 poem Trees, beginning, "I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree." James Whitcomb Riley worked as a salesman and a painter before becoming a writer. In 1874, he sent letters to multiple periodical and newspaper editors expressing his desire to become a poet and appealing for a job as a contributor. Dr. Diedrich managed to secure the draft that Riley used to write those letters. In addition to a holograph copy of Trees in the hand of Joyce Kilmer, the collection includes the first appearance of the poem in print, a musical rendition by composer Oscar Rossbach, and a photograph portrait of Kilmer in military uniform taken mere weeks before his death in the First World War. Music is a strength of the Diedrich Collection. Composers and musicians often provided signatures, manuscript sentiments, and handwritten bars of their music to friends, family, and collectors. Dr. Diedrich compiled dozens of examples of these musical quotations and musical manuscripts, from classical piano to marches to theatrical compositions to jazz. And on display, you'll see musical quotations by Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Jerome Kern, John Philip Sousa, and many others. Franklin D. Roosevelt, on April 24th of 1941, wrote, this is a quotation, "Because music knows no barriers of language, because it recognizes no impediments to free intercommunication, because it speaks a universal tongue, music can make us all more vividly aware of that common humanity which is ours and which shall one day unite the nations of the world in one great brotherhood." End quote. I take the quotation from an FDR letter present in Dr. Diedrich's collection. Authors of patriotic and other music often wrote out multiple copies of the lyrics to their songs, sometimes well after the original composition. The Diedrich Collection includes many examples of these holograph manuscripts, including Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic, Daniel Emmett's Dixie, George Root's Battle Cry of Freedom, James Randall's Maryland, My Maryland, George Cohen's Over There, and others. On display, you'll see Catherine Lee Bates's America the Beautiful. She's known to have written only 5 copies of her most famous hymn in her own hand. Also in the exhibit is Samuel Francis Smith's America, or My Country 'Tis of Thee. Among over 24 letters and manuscripts by Reverend Smith are a manuscript in which he recounted the circumstances under which he wrote My Country 'Tis of Thee, and a letter in which he informs a buyer that he's made 440 handwritten copies of the hymn, a stark contrast to the rarity of the America the Beautiful. The largest discrete body of musical papers in the Diedrich Collection are those of composer Rudolf Frimmel and his frequent lyricist, Daley Paskman. Frimmel studied piano and composition under Antonin Dvorak at the Prague Conservatory, and he emigrated to the United States in 1906. He gained Broadway success in the 19-teens and 1920s for his operettas such as The Firefly, Rose Marie, and The Vagabond King. On display are 2 strikingly rare photographs and signed musical quotations of instructor Dvorak and student Frimmel. As shown in an earlier slide, Dr. Diedrich's inspiration to begin collecting stemmed from a personal letter written to him by General Douglas MacArthur in 1952. Over the following decades, he collected item by item and group by group the materials that comprise his Douglas MacArthur collection. Over 1,000 letters and documents, a diary, military communications, photographs, books, pamphlets, circulars, and other manuscripts span MacArthur's military career, which began on his graduation from West Point in 1903 and concluded with his dismissal by President Truman in 1951. Additional materials pre- and post-date the general's active duty. The exhibition includes examples of manuscripts from major stages in his military career. You'll see, for example, the only diary MacArthur ever wrote, penned on his journey home from the Philippine Islands in 1904, a piece of which you can see in the slide here. Douglas MacArthur conceptualized the idea of combining members of the regular army and the National Guard into combat units. And when the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the idea was put to use in the creation of the 42nd Rainbow Division. MacArthur commanded the 84th Infantry Brigade in the division and served as Chief of Staff. On display is one of hundreds of documents from the period of the Great War. Douglas MacArthur served as superintendent of the Military Academy at West Point from 1919 to 1921, and in addition to nearly a dozen letters to Hamilton Fish Jr. during the period, is a letter to University of Michigan President Marion Burton. It's on display, expressing appreciation for the hospitality shown to Colonel Holt on his visit to Ann Arbor. He wrote, quote, "It is a source of great satisfaction to me that cordial relations have thus been established between the teaching heads of these institutions. It is our intention at West Point to do everything possible to maintain and to further these relations." End quote. The exhibition leaps past MacArthur's service in the Second World War to 1951, when President Harry Truman relieved MacArthur of his command for making multiple public statements in conflict with those of the administration. On display is a letter in which President Truman remarked on MacArthur's dismissal from his position as Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. Now, the Clements Library had acquired manuscripts and photographs pertinent to World War I and World War II as comparative examples against earlier military experiences. Purchases by Dr. Diedrich have helped make this area of collecting a significant strength of the manuscripts division. While the Clements Library is unlikely to ever be a research destination for 20th century military maps or books, in terms of manuscript collections, we now have approximately 300 archives and hundreds of individual letters, diaries, and other manuscripts of the world wars. Many of the most important papers came to the library thanks to Dr. Diedrich. In them, scholars will find resources pertinent to the everyday experiences of soldiers, military training, engineers, medical personnel, men and women on the home front, and others. But because the library's next exhibition is on World War I, I've refrained from putting on display items from the conflict. To represent the Second World War collections, I chose a diary from the papers of U.S. Naval Officer David Nash. Lieutenant Nash commanded USS Mindanao when the Japanese captured him and his fellow sailors at the fall of Corregidor in May of 1942. And for the following 3 years, Nash lived in confinement on Luzon, the hell ship Oryoku Maru, and in Manchuria. Excuse me. In his illustrated diaries, he recorded varied treatment by his captors, prison conditions, layouts of prison camps, forced agricultural labor, leisure activities, fellow prisoners and Japanese soldiers and officers, war news, and much more. One of his shipmates buried the first portion of his diary in a 5-gallon tin can on Luzon in order to be recovered later. These diaries contain so much detail that they could almost be published without annotation. Professor Diedrich spent his career teaching speech, and so it seemed fitting to conclude the exhibition with materials pertinent to one of the most powerful orators of the 20th century, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. On display are the podium notes used by Churchill at his first speech in the United States after World War II at the University of Miami on February 26, 1946. He accepted an honorary degree and addressed 17,500 persons, praising the university for its role in training Royal Air Force cadets and addressing the needs of veterans whose education had been interrupted during the war. In a characteristic fashion, Diedrich also acquired the final published text, supplementary photographs, and other related items. The final two pieces in the exhibit relate to University of Pennsylvania President Harold Stassen's efforts to secure Winston Churchill as a speaker for the 200th anniversary of the founding of their university library by Benjamin Franklin in 1751. After months of planning and preparations, the freshly re-elected prime minister canceled the speech not wanting his appearance drawn into the controversy surrounding President Truman's dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur. On display is a Winston Churchill letter of April 4th, 1951, outlining his travel arrangements and stating that, quote, "My message is simple and old, united we stand, divided we fall," end quote. Following it weeks later is a telegram delivering what must have been very unwelcome cancellation. Now, I'd considered cheekily ending this discussion with a letter by U.S. President Benjamin Harrison from the Diedrich Collection, one in which he wrote, and I quote, "You know I'm always distrait and nervous when I have a speech before me, and generally disgusted when I have one behind me," end quote. Now, despite the sincerity and levity of it, I'm opting to conclude in another manner. The Diedrich Collection is the product of sincere generosity, with philanthropic motivation, and it'll have a lasting impact on the historical record well after Dr. Diedrich and well after I'm gone. I'll conclude with a quotation by Washington Irving in the summer of 1831. "What I saved," says an old proverb, "that I lost. What I lent that I spent, what I gave that I have. And indeed a free and generous hand often sows benefits far after reaping. Even if nothing else remains of a kind deed but the recollection of having done it, this of itself is a great reward. For the recollections of good actions are the golden comforts of declining age. He who has squandered his wealth without doing one generous action is doubly ruined, being impoverished in purse and in spirit, while he who has dispersed it bounteously and charitably has laid up mental treasures beyond the reach of chance and change." And the image on the right doesn't accurately convey its true beauty, but it's a representation of a beautiful stained glass window memorializing Professor Diedrich's parents, Blandina and E.L., in Indiana. And you'll notice in the upper right, you'll see an image of the Clements Library in the glass. Thank you very much. And now, I'd be willing to take brief questions, but we are going to head over to the library to look at the exhibit itself, and I've also pulled out a selection of boxes from the Diedrich Collection in case anyone's interested to see how we house the materials and in what arrangement and so on. Dr. Diedrich had the boxes made, personally had the boxes made, and they are magnificent to look at. So look forward to seeing many of you there. Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. Did Dr. Diedrich ever marry?
Not to my knowledge, no. Joan.
I just wondered, his collection is so diverse. Where did he find how did he find everything? Was it lectures? Was it, auctions, friends of friends, other libraries that were selling?
Yeah. Dr. Diedrich acquired his materials from many different sources. You know, he would buy materials at auctions and from rare booksellers, and he'd also go and seek them out. For example, one Douglas MacArthur draft of a letter he sought out from the grandson of MacArthur's biographer. So if he knew there was something that he wanted to have, he would seek them out. And of course develop relationships with dealers, who would then know what he's interested in and be able to help, help identify materials for the collection. So. And as his relationship with the Clements Library grew, the Clements Library also, provided insight, and it became a collaborative effort to help add materials to the collection. So, yeah. It truly is extraordinary and broad. Oh.
Cheney, I know that you have a wonderful friendship with Dwayne. Can you tell us just a little bit more about how, since you've been manuscript curator, how that has kind of flourished?
I'm always hesitant to talk too much about Dr. Diedrich, although I've sat and done it now for 45 minutes on account of his privacy. But I met Dr. Diedrich about 16 years ago, the first semester I started working at the Clements Library as an undergraduate student. I was sitting in the office very meekly working on a project to enter data associated with our accession records. And it was a board meeting day, and Dwayne swept into the room with this marvelous and unique sort of energy and began engaging my predecessor and mentor, Barbara DeWolf, on a variety of different subjects related to the board meeting and to manuscripts. And before he left, he looked down at me with this sort of stern and enthusiastic look on his face and said, "Who is our new scholar?" And I was petrified and shook his hand again very meekly, and I was very impressed with the way he held himself and with his manner of speaking, and his openness to come in and just actively engage, with the students, me at the time. And so ever since then, I've admired him, and we've had a good rapport ever since. So, yeah.
I remember him from every board meeting. Well, he would come in with a case, it seemed, of materials under his arm. And sometimes he would share, and sometimes he wouldn't. He was very, very private. But he would talk about a few things every now and then. But he was never without fresh material, every single time.
And that's continually so. So, thank you, Joe. So,
Is Dr. Diedrich still alive?
yes.
Oh, I assumed he was from the way you were talking. Now, so this is something he presented to the library, but then he maintained. It became a collaborative effort. Now, is that something that happens quite a bit, or I always assume papers are donated either by an estate or by a living author, but they don't want anything more to do with it, so they just give it to the library. But this is someone who wanted to keep working on it, but house it here.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not less common, but not unique. Often collectors will spend a lifetime, amassing materials that they love, and sometimes are willing to part with them even before they are gone. In the case of Dr. Diedrich, he gave a significant volume of materials at the outset, and I showed a slide of a little section from the gift agreement, which set in motion the intention to build a collection, with his resources and his interests and expertise, in conjunction with the library's knowledge of housing and also our awareness of what scholars are using for research. But there are other examples of collectors who, whose collections come to us, who continue to add afterwards, and I think there's at least one in the room. So, oh yes, James Schoeff's collection, for example. The Clements Library's Civil War collections are named after James Schoeff, who supplied some of the initial materials in the mid-1970s. And we continue to add to the Schoeff collection when we acquire new Civil War soldiers' materials. So, okay. Well, I think I'll be heading next door, and any questions or thoughts you might have, I'd love to hear them. So again, thank you very, very much.